If you zoom in on the map of Mississippi, you'll find a few names locals say you should never visit. There's a town NASA bought out completely and turned into a restricted zone as if it never existed. There's a place where the Mississippi River suddenly changed course and abandoned the entire community. And there's a small town where people believe that on May 25th every year she returns, bringing fire to downtown exactly as promised a century ago. This isn't a list of tourist spots. These are the 10 most remote and unsettling towns in Mississippi, where history has left scars and old legends still carry weight. Watch until the end and ask yourself, which of these towns would you be brave enough to live in? Number 10. Napoleon. Napoleon sounds like the kind of place that should have a courthouse dome and brick sidewalks, not a tiny pine village tucked along the Pearl River. For most of the early 20th century, life here looked quiet in a comforting way. There was a post office where everyone knew your full name, a turpentine still breathing thin blue smoke over the trees, a little church ringing its bell on Sunday mornings, and wooden boats sitting calmly on the riverbank. If you had driven through back then, you might have thought you'd found a harmless slice of small-town Mississippi. But that's only the first layer, and it doesn't hold for long. The truth is that Napoleon didn't fade because of ghosts or legends. It faded because the world around it sped up. Freight followed the railroads instead of the river, trucks replaced boats, the turpentine business weakened, and the community began shrinking long before anyone noticed. Then came the twist nobody expected. NASA and the Department of Defense selected this whole region for rocket engine testing and built the Stennis Space Center. To protect the surrounding area from noise and danger, they created a massive buffer zone. Napoleon ended up inside it, almost swallowed by a map drawn for machines instead of people. Families were bought out. Homes were abandoned. The graveyard stayed, but now it sits in a place where the silence feels heavier than the history. Some locals say that after a test run, when the air finally stops shaking, you can hear things you're not sure belong to the present. A faint bell, a river sound with no boat. Maybe it's memory trying to speak through the pines. Or maybe it's just what happens when a town disappears but refuses to let go completely. Walk the narrow road today and you'll understand why people describe Napoleon as the line between two worlds. The sign still stands, but the houses look unsure of themselves, like they're waiting for instructions that never arrive. Nothing tells you to leave, yet everything suggests you shouldn't linger. And that's the real question. Would you follow Google Maps into a place where the route is clear, but the last metal sign quietly warns you to turn back? There's no cafe, no friendly porch light, just mosquitoes, old fences, and the steady rhythm of no trespassing signs. And if this is how a small village looks when rockets push it aside, the next town on our list shows what happens when the lights once burned brighter, before the forest closed the curtain. Number 9. Electric Mills. Electric Mills once looked like a promise carved straight into the pine woods, a model company town powered by its own lumber waste, a place where streetlights glowed, the movie theater hummed on Friday nights, and kids licked ice cream under lamps that never seemed to flicker. For a moment, it felt like the forest itself had agreed to stay quiet and let people dream. But that was only the surface. Beneath the postcard shine was a timer no one could hear ticking. When the surrounding pines were cut faster than they could grow back, the mill's lifeline thinned, then snapped. And when the company decided the numbers no longer worked, the decision was swift. One closed mill meeting in another city, and Electric Mills fell dark. That is where the story turns, because the end of the mill wasn't just an economic shift, it was a full erasure. Workers dismantled their own houses piece by piece, loading boards onto trucks headed for other towns. What stayed behind wasn't a neighborhood. It was a stripped skeleton of concrete slabs, orphaned sidewalks, and chimneys with nothing to guard. Visitors who return today describe a silence that feels too complete, as if the forest around the old town swallowed not only the buildings, but the noise memory itself. The wind is the only thing that moves, scraping through the pine needles like a whisper trying to mimic the machines that once drowned it out. Walk long enough and you notice the strange geometry beneath the leaves. long, perfect lines of concrete that lead nowhere, ending abruptly like half-erased sentences. Night is worse. There are no lights, no distant hum of cars, nothing except the sound of your own footsteps bouncing back at you. Some swear they still hear the faint metallic rhythm of the old mill if they stand still long enough, a slow pulse hiding under the crickets. It might just be the forest settling, or it might be something remembering. The truth is simple and cruel. Electric mills lived and died by one company, one industry, and one supply chain that never cared about permanence. When the plug was pulled, the town went dark without ceremony, like a lamp unplugged from a wall. And that leaves one question hanging. Would you ever bet your entire life on a town where a corporate meeting room decides your future? If you do visit, bring a flashlight and don't wander alone. The forest here has a habit of closing in quietly. Number 8. BANKSTON. BANKSTON began like one of those early American success stories people love to tell. A 19th century textile startup hidden in the woods of Choctaw County, powered by cotton, wool, water wheels, and the rhythm of small industry. The mill clattered through the day, the shoe shop hammered through the afternoon, and children played near the creek without ever wondering how unusual it was for a rural settlement to feel this alive. For a while, the place truly believed it had found its purpose. Then history walked straight through the front door and turned everything upside down. During the Civil War, BANKSTON became a supply point for the Confederacy, stitching uniforms and turning out shoes as if productivity alone could shield it. But one winter night in late 1864, while families slept under thin roofs, Union troops arrived quietly and made a decision that would erase the town in less than a sunrise. They burned the mill, the shoe factory, the warehouses, the heart of the town itself, and by dawn, BANKSTON was a skeleton of smoking beams and warped metal. That should have been the end, but BANKSTON tried to rise once more after the war. It rebuilt what it could, patched roofs, repaired machinery, and tried to pretend the fire had not carved a scar across its future. Then the second blaze came. Whether accident or a final act of misfortune, it destroyed what little faith remained. The company withdrew and the town dissolved, not with a farewell, but with a shrug. What lingers today is not a town, but a cemetery bearing its name. BANKSTON Cemetery is the last witness, the final piece of proof that people once lived and worked and died here. And that is where the stories take a darker turn. Visitors whisper about hearing faint metallic tapping in the woods, a sound with no source, as if the old mill is still running somewhere behind the trees. The forest floor is green and damp, broken only by gray stones and red soil where foundations used to be. Stand there long enough and you feel the strange heaviness of a place erased twice, as if the land itself is tired of rebuilding. It raises a question most people don't want to consider. If a town can vanish simply because someone decides to burn it, would you ever trust your entire life to such a place? And if you wander out there today, stay alert. This is private land, thick forest, and the first thing to greet you is more likely a snake sliding through the leaves than any sign of welcome. Number 7. Gainesville. Gainesville began as the kind of river town travel books love to romanticize. Wooden boats along the Pearl River, a small market where farmers traded timber, turpentine, and produce, two-story houses looking down over the water. On a clear day, you could stand on the bluff and see everything that kept the town alive move slowly past. It looked like a picture of the Old South frozen in an easy moment. Then the river stopped being the most important line on the map. Freight switched to rail, then to highways, and Gainesville felt the current of money slide away from its docks. The port still existed, but it mattered less every year. Stores closed earlier, young people left. The town was not dying in a dramatic way, just thinning out, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. That would have been a sad but ordinary story. The real twist arrived when the sky became more valuable than the shoreline. The federal government chose this slice of Mississippi for a rocket testing complex that would become Stennis Space Center. They needed a wide safety buffer, a place where noise, shock, and risk could stretch without hitting crowds of people. On the map, Gainesville found itself inside a circle that meant something simple and brutal. This would not be a place for families anymore. It would be a cushion for engines. Land was bought, families were relocated, even the church moved. One by one, the houses emptied until the river town dissolved into open ground, patches of grass and trees stitched together by strips of abandoned pavement. Ask the few people who go back now and they will tell you the same thing. You stand by the Pearl and there is nothing but a bare bank, bits of foundation in the dirt, and somewhere far off the low mechanical growl of a test run. It feels wrong and fascinating at the same time, like standing between two overlapping worlds. On one side is the ghost of timber and river trade. On the other is the space program, concrete and steel behind fences. In the middle, there is a place where nobody is allowed to truly live. It leaves you with an uneasy question. Would you pitch a tent in a spot where the sky above your head was designed for rocket engines to scream, not for campfires and quiet stories? And if you try to film your eerie travel vlog here, remember that this is sensitive land. One wrong step and your evening of ghost hunting could turn into a very real conversation with federal security by morning. If the rocket towns are creepy because of enforced silence, the next place on our list is unsettling for another reason entirely. It did not die because of government orders, but because something tiny and hungry went to war with the land itself. Number 6. Rocky Springs. Rocky Springs looks harmless when you first pull off Natchez Trace Parkway. There is a small brick church that could be on a postcard, an old cemetery tucked under the trees, and a shaded walking trail that feels perfect for a family picnic. If you didn't know anything about its past, you might think this was one of those peaceful rest stops that time decided to protect. But that calm is only the surface, and the ground underneath is carrying a story that doesn't match the sunshine at all. The unraveling began in 1878 when yellow fever swept across Mississippi. For a town as small and close-knit as Rocky Springs, the disease wasn't just an illness, it was terror with a timetable. People fell sick fast, families barricaded themselves inside, and funerals happened so quietly that the sound of dirt falling on coffins became part of the background. The cemetery began to fill faster than anyone wanted to admit, and the church bells that once marked Sundays became an alarm no one wanted to hear. When the fever finally passed, it left a town that was shaken thin and already leaning on one fragile industry. That is when the next blow arrived. The boll weevil moved across the south like a slow-moving curse, chewing its way through cotton fields until nothing worth harvesting remained. For Rocky Springs, cotton wasn't just a crop, it was the plan, the income and the future all wrapped into one plant. Once the weevil settled in, the farms failed, erosion tore at the land, and families realized there was nothing left to rebuild. The last store closed. The spring that gave the town its name dried up. One by one, the homes emptied until Rocky Springs was no longer a town, just a church and a scattering of headstones watching the forest take back the earth. Visitors who walk the old road today talk about the silence first. There are no cars, no nearby houses, only wind moving through the trees and the crunch of leaves under your own boots. Some claim they hear a faint church bell or a low whisper, even though there are no residents here, no services, nothing that should make a sound. If you film audio out here, it always picks up more space than expected, a strange emptiness that doesn't feel fully empty. It all leads to one uneasy question. Would you feel comfortable walking alone through a cemetery where every gravestone is basically a timestamp of disease, misfortune, and decline? And even though this is NPS land and open during the day, the forest has its own rules. When the light fades, there are no neighbors, no lights, just insects humming and whatever your imagination decides to do with the darkness. The next town on our list takes that theme even further. There, yellow fever didn't just thin out the community, it erased almost every living soul, leaving behind a cemetery so forgotten it feels like it's waiting for someone to remember it by accident. Number 5. BEECHLAND. BEECHLAND sounds gentle when you first hear the name. It suggests trees, shade, and maybe a small country church near the river outside Vicksburg. For a long time, that is exactly what it was. A little rural satellite community with farmhouses, a congregation, a family burial ground, and a life built quietly on river trade and neighbor gossip. It never tried to be important. It just existed. Then 1878 arrived, and with it, yellow fever. In a tiny place like Beechland, the disease did not simply make people sick. It tore straight through families. The story that survives in local history is almost too heavy to linger on. A pastor who spent 22 days burying his own family one after another, then left and never came back. Shops shut their doors and never unlocked them again. Houses that had always felt permanent became empty in a single season. When the wave of sickness finally moved on, Beechland felt less like a town and more like a page someone had wiped half clean. The years after that did not bring a comeback. Beechland was too small to be anyone's priority for rebuilding. Bigger towns drew the money and the doctors and the survivors. The little community quietly fell off the list. Roofs sagged, paths blurred. Whatever was left of Beechland folded into private land and trees. The only thing that refused to disappear completely was the cemetery. Today, Beechland Cemetery is described in some records as an almost lost graveyard. And standing there, you understand why. There is no neat public driveway, no visitor center, no friendly sign saying welcome. The forest presses in from every side. The most striking feature is a tall monument covered in writing on all four faces, rising out of weeds and brush like someone stuck a stone exclamation mark in the middle of nowhere. If you walked in without knowing the story, you might think it was just an old family plot that time forgot. Then the silence starts to bother you. There are no traffic sounds, no nearby houses, no hum from a distant highway, only insects, the occasional bird, and the feeling that you are standing on the ghost of a town the map no longer bothers to draw. You find yourself wondering how many front doors and dinner tables once stood where you were stepping, and how fast they were erased by something too small to see. It feels less like a location and more like a file that has been deleted but not quite overwritten. So here is the uncomfortable question. If people cannot even agree on where the town actually was, do you really want to be the one who marches in there alone just to say you checked in? This is not a tourist attraction, and it is definitely not an internet photo spot. To get anywhere near it, you need to know whose land you are on, how you are getting back out, and what you will do if the path you use suddenly does not look the same. Beechland is ghost town minimalism, stripped down to a single graveyard. The next place on our list leaves a lot more behind, from earthworks to churches to a full historic park. Then adds one more twist beside it all, a nuclear plant humming just down the river. Number 4, Grand Gulf. Grand Gulf looks harmless when you first roll into the state park. The old church stands neat and proper, the observation tower watches over the river bend, and the picnic tables sit in the shade as if they have never known anything louder than children on a weekend outing. The Battlefield Museum leans toward the picturesque, the kind of place where families take photos without realizing they are standing on ground once soaked in fear. For a moment, it feels like a postcard that somehow escaped the chaos of Mississippi's past. Then you start peeling back the layers. In the 19th century, this was a booming cotton port, a river hub with theaters, schools, and a confidence that seemed unshakable. But Grand Gulf was hit again and again by problems no town can outrun. Epidemics thinned the population, tornadoes shredded what people built, the Mississippi River shifted its flow, chewing away at the shoreline, and the Civil War brought artillery that finished what nature started. One disaster weakened the economy, the next carved up the streets, the next erased what was left. Eventually, Grand Gulf collapsed so completely that the only way to preserve it was to freeze it in time. The modern visitor walks through a curated version of a town that no longer breathes. That is where the stories begin to get strange. People talk about shadowy figures near the earthworks, footsteps on the old batteries, and sounds that resemble rifles cracking across the trees even when no reenactment is scheduled. The cemetery holds soldiers whose names are barely readable now, and some visitors swear they hear murmurs around the graves when the wind dies down. But the eeriest moment comes when you turn your camera toward the horizon and see something the Civil War never imagined. Rising in the background is the Grand Gulf Nuclear Station, humming quietly behind the trees like a modern ghost watching over an older one. The air here feels split in two. On one side is a tidy state park, brochures, campsites, and rules posted neatly on a board. On the other is a long archive of disaster, combat, and disease wrapped in a frontier story that did not survive. Beneath both sites the skeleton of a town the river decided it no longer needed. So the question becomes uncomfortably real. Would you camp in a place where the left side of your tent faces a Civil War battlefield and the right side faces a nuclear reactor, while beneath your feet lies a riverport that tried and failed to outlive any of it? The park is open, the hours are clear, but the line between a quiet stroll and the edge of critical infrastructure is thinner than it looks. And if this is where past and present meet in a strange cold handshake, the next town on our list strips everything down even further. Just a trail, a cemetery, and a kind of silence that sits heavy on the shoulders. Number 3. LOGTOWN. LOGTOWN began the way many southern timber towns did, with sawmills humming from dawn to dusk and small worker houses lined up neatly beside a narrow-gauge rail line. Everything revolved around the forest and the river. Trees came in, lumber went out, and life moved in a steady rhythm of whistles, steam, and the sound of boots hitting wooden porches at the end of a long workday. For a while it felt like a model community, simple but secure, a place where the only thing anyone worried about was rain slowing the logging crews. But in a town built on wood, the end always arrives when the forest thins. When the timber ran out and the mill shut down, LOGTOWN shrank like a lung exhaling for the last time. Families left, businesses folded, what remained hung on by habit more than hope. Then the 1960s delivered the final chapter. The federal government needed a vast noise buffer for NASA's rocket testing, and LOGTOWN happened to sit right where the map needed empty. Space. Land was purchased, residents were relocated, and the town quietly exited the stage. By the time the ink dried, LOGTOWN existed only in archives and memories. Today, the place has been reduced to something almost surreal. The Possum Walk Trail winds directly over what used to be Main Street. People jog or stroll with their dogs, blissfully unaware that their feet are landing where grocery stores, houses, and saloons once stood. If you slow down and look past the greenery, the foundations peek out like faint fingerprints. The forest has not fully erased. The one part that still feels undeniably like a town is the cemetery. LOGTOWN Cemetery sits under old trees whose roots curl around headstones bearing the same surnames again and again, the whole community gathered in stillness. Visitors describe the walk up to the entrance as strangely heavy. The kind of silence that is not empty but full of something unspoken. When the sunlight filters through the branches, the tombstones catch the glow in a way that makes them look like quiet lanterns marking the edge of another world. All of that leads to a simple question. How safe would you feel walking a trail where the only living residents are trees, and everyone who used to call the place home now rests beneath the grass? The trail is beautiful, yes, but once the daylight fades, there are no neighbors, no porch lights, and no friendly house where you can borrow a phone charger. Out here, every problem becomes something you solve with nothing but yourself. And if this is the ghost town that pretends to be a healthy nature walk, the next place on our list does not even leave dry ground to walk on. It sank into mud, floods, and swamp, and the only things left standing are two churches that refuse to decay. Number 2. RODNEY. RODNEY is one of those places that make you ask how almost can ruin an entire destiny. It was once a serious candidate to become the capital of Mississippi, a busy river port where steamboats docked, bankers shook hands, and people dressed up for opera nights in a town that had its own newspaper and big brick churches. For a while, it looked like the river had chosen RODNEY as its favorite child. Everything important arrived by water, and everything hopeful left the same way. Then the Rivertown script began to fall apart. Epidemics swept through and left empty chairs at dinner tables. Fires chewed through wooden buildings that nobody thought would burn. War arrived in the form of blue uniforms and gunboats drifting along the Mississippi. One story still clings to the walls here. During the Civil War, a Union vessel fired its cannon at the Presbyterian church while terrified residents were hiding inside. The scar in the brick is still there, a dark hollow where stone should be, like the town tried to heal and never quite finished the job. After the war, Rodney could have faded slowly like so many other river communities, but the Mississippi River had one more twist to deliver. It changed its course. The main channel moved away, leaving the town stranded beside a lazy side stream instead of the busy artery that had fed it. The port withered, commerce died, floods returned again and again, turning the old downtown into mud and silt. Each time the water went down, a little less of Rodney came back. Houses sagged, shops closed, and the grand dream of a capital in waiting shrank into a few stubborn buildings sinking into the wet ground. Today, two exhausted churches rise out of the weeds and mud, watched from above by a hilltop cemetery that seems to be keeping count. Visitors describe a strange feeling of being seen when they stand on the church steps, as if somebody is still at the window watching for a steamboat that is never coming. Locals whisper about hearing bells ring at night, even though nobody lives close enough to ring them. When the river fog rolls in, the buildings look like they are surfacing from underwater just long enough to take another breath. It brings up a hard question. If you had to choose between a shabby apartment in a living city or a beautiful old house inside a town that floods and rots, a little more each year, which one would really feel safer? Rodney today is perfect for moody footage and a strong tetanus shot. The road in is rough, the structures are fragile, and when the water rises, the whole place can be cut off like an island made of memory. Rodney is what happens when you build your future on a river that decides it has better things to do. And if this is what a nearly abandoned port feels like, the final town on our list is One Step Stranger. Because it is not fully dead at all. People still live there, and that is exactly what makes its legends harder to shake off. Number 1. Yazoo City. At first glance, Yazoo City looks almost too bright for a ghost story. Downtown is painted in candy colors, blues and greens and reds, stacked along the street like somebody designed it for a postcard rack. There is blues history, small churches on quiet corners, and mom-and-pop businesses that feel very ordinary, almost cute. If you drove through without stopping, you might file it away in your mind as just another Delta town trying to stay cheerful. The trouble starts when you drive up the hill to Glenwood Cemetery. In the daylight, it is beautiful, an old southern graveyard with rolling ground, big trees and stone markers scattered over the slope, like history dropped them there one by one. Tour books call it one of the most historic cemeteries in the region, but tucked inside all that green is a story that refuses to stay buried. On the 25th of May in 1904, a fire started in Yazoo City and turned into a nightmare. Within hours, hundreds of buildings downtown were gone. Whole blocks went up, leaving people watching their future burn from the sidewalk. The town had to rebuild almost from scratch. Officially, the causes are familiar and boring: wooden buildings, bad fire protection, wind, and weather all lining up at the wrong moment. That should have been enough to explain everything. The town, however, had another story ready. Local legend talks about the Witch of Yazoo, an old woman who lived by the river and was caught tormenting fishermen. Chased through the woods, she fell into a swamp. Just before she died, she supposedly spat out a promise that she would be back in 20 years to burn the town on May 25th, 1904. In Glenwood, there is a grave ringed with an iron chain that people point to as hers. After the fire, folks swore the chain had snapped. Every time the city repairs it, sooner or later something cracks, bends, or breaks again, just enough to keep imaginations fed. Stand there at dusk, looking from the chained grave down toward the town that really did burn on that exact date, and it is hard not to feel the hair on your arms rise a little. So what do you believe? If you stand in front of that grave, read the dates on the stone, and then look back toward the rebuilt streets below, do you see pure coincidence or a curse with very good marketing? Either way, Glenwood is a real cemetery with real people under the dirt. You come here to listen to a story, not to stomp on graves or play witch hunter. The only curse you truly do not want to take home is disrespect. And that leaves one last question hanging over the end of this video. Out of all 10 names today, which town made you shiver the most through a screen? And out there on the map of the United States, how many more places like these are still hiding in the empty spaces we never bothered to zoom in on? Not every town with pretty trees, quiet churches, and a friendly welcome sign is built on happy stories. Some of these places were squeezed to death by war, disease, bad luck, economic collapse, or decisions made by people who never lived there. What remains today is a strange mix of memories, ruins, legends, and silence, waiting for time and for channels like ours to keep the story alive a little longer. So here's the question for you. Out of these 10 towns, which one sent the coldest shiver down your spine, and which one, despite everything, still makes you want to visit just to feel the atmosphere for yourself? And if this video opened your eyes to the darker side of towns that look harmless at first glance, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the list of American places you probably should not move to is only getting started.